So I'm a good academic, and if you give me long enough, I'll get to talking about the postmodern condition. And a lot of people misunderstand postmodernism. I'm not going to go into a very detailed explanation because that would eat up all of the 30 minutes and more. But a short way to describe it would be, and this is the language that the man who coined the term, Jean-François Lyotard, originally used, that it is incredulity toward meta-narratives. And to put that in slightly plainer English, it just means that anytime you hear a grand explanation, a statement made, or a formula that's supposed to explain much of reality, you should treat it as guilty until proven innocent. It's the idea that knowledge tends to be local, knowledge tends to be situational, and that anyone who has one grand explanation that encompasses everything, that's probably a power move. That's probably ideological. And because I'm an academic, for years and years and years, I've heard that you people out there on the left wing, you're the relativists. And we on the right wing, we're the ones who believe in right and wrong. And we're the ones who really understand the real world. And we don't live in the ivory tower. And we're the ones who are able to face facts. And something that I'm struck by, that I got really struck by this week, the whole phenomenon of fake news. Fake news exists, very definitely. Fake news, there are plenty of examples of genuinely fake news that were concocted and then circulated, promulgated for the purpose of achieving someone's purpose. For the purpose of achieving someone's purpose. There's a good sentence. But fake news definitely exists, but there's this move that's become popular, and Donald Trump's used it a lot, and he's not the only one using it, to call something fake news in the hope that it will go away. To call something fake news when actually it's not that hard to go out and confirm that the thing that you called fake news is actually a fact. And that is one very peculiar and fairly new in how widespread it is and how much it's happening at fairly high levels, how much publicity it's getting, but it's a particular kind of motivated reasoning. Now, motivated reasoning, the idea, I think I've talked about this before, the idea is instead of going out to examine the evidence and find out what the right answer is, what you do is you go out to cherry pick the evidence that will confirm what you want the answer to be. And so, this whole turn toward labeling things fake news, this whole turn toward motivated reasoning, I treat this, I think, my instinct tells me, my gut tells me, that that's an extension, that is the ripple traveling out further of distrust of certain sources, distrust of descriptions of the world, and trust based on loyalty, based on belonging to the group. And so, what I got to thinking about this week was, it really doesn't seem in this latest turn of events in civic life in my community, it doesn't seem as though the people on the left wing are the relativists anymore. It seems as though the relativists are the ones on the right wing. That all of this motivated reasoning, that all of this dismissing sources, dismissing things that could actually be confirmed as fake news, this, even if you can prove to me that violent crime is falling, I don't feel safer. Therefore, crime is worse, and we should get tough on crime, and we should go back to mandatory minimums because I don't feel safer. That, I think, is the form that right-wing relativism has taken. And a thought that hit me just this morning, and I'm sure it's not original to me, but I just got to thinking about this and couldn't put it down mentally. I think that the way information is being sold to us now, and the way that it is being used as bait on the hook to get clicks, to get eyeballs, and therefore to make money in the new media environment, the phenomenon of clickbait, what I think that is, the line that I wrote down was, clickbait is yoga for belief structures. Let me say that one more time, see if I can make sense of it to myself. Clickbait is yoga for belief structures. some things that are clickbait, they're attractive because you can tell from the little bit that you're offered that they're going to be pleasant. So there are lots of cat pictures. There's dropping the name of a celebrity that draws a lot of attention. Those can be effective clickbait. But really, the classic form of clickbait is you will be surprised when you read this. This will in some way be unexpected. And when we are fed this diet of the unexpected, one unexpected bit after another, I thought that A was true, and it turns out here's a web page that tells me not A is true. We are put in the situation day after day after day of having things we formerly believed, if not disproven, at least challenged. And that is set up in such a way that it's reinforcing, that it's actually pleasant, that we seek it out and we try to find more of it. And so instead of having a lot of things about the world that we think are probably true, we have to hold loosely to anything that we believe is true about the world. I half expect this afternoon to come across a website that says, you may have thought that 2 plus 2 is 4, but you won't believe what this mathematician found. Because that is becoming such an everyday occurrence, and not just every day, but dozens and dozens of times every single day, that I think what is being cultivated in us is this cognitive posture of expecting and seeking to have things that we believe violated. And the problem is, I think that limber believers, people who hold to all their beliefs loosely, they are really put in prime position to become motivated reasoners. I think that if you want to be a self-disciplined thinker, if you want to have healthy skepticism, you have to have a certain familiarity, a certain habituation to saying, even though I am being offered evidence, even though I am being tempted to believe that this is true, I know certain other things are true that exclude this from being true. But you have to have a lot of faith bordering on stubbornness, that those other things that you know, they are not likely to be disproven. If you want to resist people's attempts to swindle you by sticking to the idea that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is, then that particular formulation, that particular bit of wisdom, that has to be bedrock under your feet. And when over and over again, every day, you find it pleasant to have things you believed were true challenged, then it feels like nothing is bedrock under your feet, or certainly fewer things than previous generations might have found. One stray thought that crossed my mind when I was sort of turning this over and over is, I wonder, well, and it was kind of a silly thought, I don't think that you would find much motivated reasoning among the Amish, because I do not think that they have much experience with clickbait. And I think probably through the day and through the seasons, they develop certain beliefs, and there are certain things that they trust will continue to be true, and those are not challenged. And certainly it's not a form of entertainment or a form of recreation for them to have for them to entertain challenges to what they believed to be true. And so I think you would probably find a lot less by way of motivated reasoning. So that all just sort of descended on me this morning. What I'd been thinking about over the weekend, there was an episode of This American Life, I think it's about 3 episodes back, and off the top of my head, I think the title of it was How We Got to Now. And it was the story of how Dave Bratt, who at the time was an economics professor at Randolph-Macon College, how he challenged Eric Cantor, who was the House Majority Leader in the Republican primary. And in the history of the United States, the Majority Leader of the House of Representatives had never lost a primary election, but Eric Cantor did. And in hearing them tell the story of this, I was struck by a number of things, and I developed a mental picture. And I'll get down into the details of what I was thinking while I was listening to that podcast a few minutes from now. But the mental picture I got was of sitting in the intensive care unit of a hospital, being in pain, being alarmed because you're bleeding or you've got a compound fracture, you've got some kind of health emergency that you would expect people would drop everything and rush to help you. but being told to sit and wait because people keep coming in who are worse off than you, people who are closer to death, and over again, you're told to wait. You're told to move to the back, that other people's needs are greater. And what would grow in you is pain and desperation. And I thought about this because what I have talked about before and what I was thinking about again over the weekend are the forms of economic dislocation and social dislocation that are making life difficult to live and making it difficult to make a better life for the generation that follows for everybody in the United States. And people are going to take this experience of suffering and they're going to craft a narrative to try to make sense of it. And there was a certain segment of the population who were told, there are resources for coping with poverty. There are resources for coping with food insecurity. They are not available to you. They're made available to other groups because these other groups have been historically disadvantaged. They've been historically marginalized. There are scholarships that will not be made available to you because they're set aside for these other groups. So even though you see your own children don't have a clear career path and you stay up at night wondering how you're going to afford college for your children, you learn through news reports about scholarships that will be made available to other people but not to you because these other people have it worse. And so that sense of pain and that sense of desperation grows. In my conflict class, one of the topics we take up is emotion, and we talk about primary emotion and secondary emotion, and very often you look at someone and the emotion that they seem to be displaying may not be the emotion that they're experiencing inside. That men in particular will put on displays that look a lot like anger, like rage, like hostility, but their inner experience may be fear. That women, fairly commonly, they'll burst into tears and they'll look sad and they'll look as though they are in need of help, but really what they're feeling inside is fury, and those are tears of frustration and exasperation. And what struck me as I was thinking about that, rage can look like fear, fear can look like anger, I got that backwards, but what can also look like anger, desperation and pain, can look like anger. And if you have a dog, and if you've ever had to take the dog to the vet with a severe, painful injury, you got to wrap that dog up. You got to restrain that dog a little bit, or you're going to have some bite wounds to deal with by the time you get to the vet, because the dog may bark at you, snap at you, snarl at you, because it hurts, not because it hates you. But the two can look indistinguishable. The other thing that's true is that pain and desperation can be a very, very powerful motivator. And if you need proof of that, just go ask anyone who's ever worked as a lifeguard. What they're trained to do is, if someone's drowning, you want to throw them something they can grab onto, throw them a rope, reach out to them with one of the big long nets that they use to scoop things out of the pool, stick the handle out and let them grab onto that. If they can grab onto that and calm down, that's a good way to rescue them. But if you go into that pool and you try to grab them, they will try to shove you, or they may try to, in their panic, try to shove you down under the water. It's not as though they're trying to dunk you, trying to drown you, to kill you. That's desperation. And so, when you have a certain segment of the electorate that is in pain and desperate, and you have another segment of the electorate that feels alienated and feels apathetic, what you get out of that recipe is the 2016 presidential election. And way back at the beginning of this entire enterprise, I called that a sneaker wave, and I said that it was a confluence of forces. And I am feeling pretty comfortable that those are the two of the forces that reinforced one another. So, when you have people who feel very insecure, very not invested in what everyone else seems to do, then what you can fall back on is you can fall back on finding a place to belong. You can fall back on banding together. And so, I think patriotism in the United States, it was used not necessarily as the tool of a grand conspiracy, but I think there were a lot of groups who found it very convenient to use patriotism to define America as the country whose essence, whose uniting characteristic was freedom, and freedom, one extension of freedom, is you take profit-making industry and you call it free enterprise, and you explain capitalism as the logical outgrowth of freedom and of property rights, which, you know, if you were to take some of the folks who grew up thinking, well, that's just a bedrock truth of the universe, and you took them over to spend a couple of months or a couple of years up in the Nordic countries, where they are very individualist and very much believe in letting people do what they want to do, but they also believe in a collective effort to provide the basic necessities for everyone so that they are freed up to do what they want to do because nobody has to worry about those basic necessities, then you would know that it is possible to believe in freedom and not think that a necessarily entailed idea was free enterprise and extreme polarization, extreme economic inequality. But here in the United States, based on our history and based on certain people's motivation to try to make their wealth permanent and make their wealth get bigger and bigger and bigger, here that has been entangled with freedom, which means, and this fairly confused idea I've been working on for about the past 60 seconds, it means that a lot of the folks sitting in the emergency room, seeing themselves slip further and further behind, realizing that their kids may not have a better life than they had because they can't afford college or they have other economic difficulties, their career is shriveling up underneath them and they don't know what to do about it. They also, though, absolutely decline to support any sort of effort, any sort of movement to address income inequality, because that would be putting a limit on freedom. And they consider themselves, where they belong is that they are patriots who love their country, and their country is defined by freedom, and that means income inequality just as gross as possible. One of the thoughts I had along the way, okay, I don't know. At the same time, I feel uncomfortable saying this, but I also feel fairly sure of it. Make America great again. Make America great again. America, in Make America Great Again, very definitely means white people. It does not necessarily mean that to the people who say it. It does not necessarily mean that to Donald Trump. That is not my claim. And I also think that there are people of color. I think there are people who belong to marginalized groups who hear Make America Great Again, and they agree with it, and they support what is associated with that. But for a huge, huge segment of all the people who hear it and respond to it, a huge segment, I will say the overwhelming majority of the segment, they hear it, and implicitly, maybe even never consciously admitting it to themselves, they do hear white. The mental picture that comes up, the America in Make America Great Again, is the white male. Sometimes they're explicit about it. A fairly small segment is right out in the open about it. And white supremacists, by and large, tend to be fully foursquare behind this. But there are also a whole lot of people who would never, ever, ever call themselves white supremacists. They would never align themselves with white supremacists. And I think it's implicit, but I think they do deep down. The picture they associate with the America and Make America Great Again is white people. And I got from that to thinking about what happens with prison gangs. What happens with the self-help, self-protection groups that form when the institutions of civility break down, when you are not protected by the consensus on what kind of behavior is proper, the kind of community you have inside a penitentiary. Those self-help groups form very commonly around race. Very easy way to form an in-group and to form an out-group, or to distinguish yourself at a glance from an out-group. It leaves no ambiguity in where the boundaries are between the groups. So, to get back to this podcast, this American Life episode, what I knew but had kind of lost sight of was that the Republican Party was completely surprised. Not just the party, but the people running Dave Bratt's campaign against Eddie Cantor. They were completely surprised when he won. And if you watch carefully, the Trump campaign was surprised when Trump won. Trump didn't expect to win. And this current, this desperation plus pain, this is something that has been growing. This is something that has been on. It is a more and more powerful current in civic activity in the United States. And it doesn't go back one election cycle. It doesn't just go back to 2012, even though you could find signs of it there. It doesn't just go back to the Bush years. I talked a little bit about this in the past couple of weeks, but I still remember when Rush Limbaugh reached a tipping point and all of a sudden he had power. All of a sudden he was a phenomenon, and there was a whole new branch to the broadcast industry of the right-wing talk radio host, and the angry white man who felt that he was being left behind. And there were a lot of associated demographic groups who also consumed that media and also supported it, but the core group was the alienated, disaffected white man who felt like he was being left behind. And when even the Republicans are surprised by what happens in the 2014 and 2016 election, when the Bratt campaign would have considered it a victory if they got 40% of the vote in the primary, and instead they won a resounding victory that wasn't even close, then you know that what you've got there, you have got a geyser. You have got an active volcano that is on the point of erupting. This is not something that was the result of a carefully designed strategy. This was not a successful campaign. This instead was a boat that got picked up by a tsunami and taken in the direction that the boat wanted to go. But I do have to say, based on this and based on other signs that I see as I watch, there are a whole lot of people in the Republican Party who are really uneasy, dismayed, even frightened by the direction this is going. And so I think this actually helps because, I mean, yes, I still watch what happens day to day in the policies that are being adopted, in the proposals that are being forwarded, and I think that they are enormously damaging, and I think it's a terrible idea for the United States to pull out of the Paris Agreement. But I also think I am less tempted to believe that this was a group of people with sinister motives who managed to hit upon a way of grabbing power for themselves, and now they are running amok. I don't think it's that at all. I think they were swept into power. I think they are trying to get a grip on what exactly do we do to channel this into something that's more healthy and constructive. And it helps me step back from thinking of them as enemies, as monsters, any of that I get tempted to do. And I will also say, another very helpful thought, another fairly constructive thought is, I don't think that conservatives, Republicans, people on the right wing had a monopoly on motivated reasoning. I think that people whose politics are a lot closer to mine, we had our own motivated reasoning. I think that we managed to ignore the building storm. I think we managed to go to sleep. I think in some ways 2016 was Pearl Harbor. Now, one of the differences there, one of the reasons that analogy breaks down, is that Pearl Harbor galvanized a country that was ready to pull its resources together and ready to flex its muscles and use its strength in a constructive way. And I'm not seeing much sign that the 2016 election caused people on the left wing of American politics to put differences aside and actually use the resources available. Maybe that'll wind up happening, but I'm not too optimistic about that yet. The one last thought, and this actually just sort of hit me this morning, the gap between a criticism of a leader that is enough to outrage the opponents and a criticism that is sufficient, that hits the right notes to shake the confidence of people who are followers of the leader. So I think back to when Barack Obama was still president, and one of my fellow Southern Baptists might say to me, "Can you believe Barack Obama doesn't think abortion should be illegal?" And that's the kind of thing that would cause outrage among a lot of the people who would vote for Barack Obama's opponents. But if that charge was leveled, I think I would probably say, I don't think abortion should be illegal. And I don't. I think that my beliefs on abortion take a little while to lay out. But the one thing I don't think you can make a case for, including out of the Bible, is that it ought to be illegal. There's a big gap between saying we should bring the total number of abortions that happens down to zero, which I agree with. There's a big gap between saying no one should ever, ever, ever have an abortion, which I agree with, and saying abortion should be illegal. So when someone levels a charge and they expect that that charge will be enough to outrage me, and it doesn't outrage me, that is one of the experiences which, when it's repeated over and over again, I think drives polarization. So can you believe that Donald Trump can say near a live microphone that you can grab women by their genitalia, that he could do it and he would enjoy doing it, and he can still be elected president? And I think about a lot of the people that I know from the time that I lived down in the Deep South who would say, well, in the first place, my wife and my daughters know how to shoot a gun. And any man who tries to impose himself on them is in for an unpleasant surprise. And in the second place, a lot of the men I know, a lot of the men in leadership positions, you get them off in private, and the way they talk is very crude. It's a particular form of sense of humor. It's insider talk. So, no, they are not at all outraged by that. And we circulate this back and forth. That is enough to outrage the people who were opponents in the first place, and we reach out to those who are supporters, and we use what outraged us, and we expect that they will have no choice but to back off from their support, and then they don't do it. And I watched it happen over and over again through all 8 years that Barack Obama was president. All these, his opponents, just outraged over something he'd said, and it didn't seem outrageous. And so this gap between what can seem to you when you're already primed to, when you're already looking for ammunition, when you're looking for what will it take, and it's even been phrased explicitly that way, what would it take? Several times during Trump's campaign, his supporters were asked on camera, what would he have to say for you to no longer support him? And they would look right into the camera and say, there's nothing he could say. Partly because they knew that's a baited question. You didn't come in with that question as a fellow supporter asking, what's the right thing for us to do? Instead, you're an opponent, which means you're on the other team. And you're looking for ammunition, and I'm not going to give you any. And you can walk away shaking your head about me because I say there's nothing that he could say, and you can call me a robot and a dupe, but I don't care what you think because you're on that other team. The one last thought that I had, and this may have to be something that I start up next week's episode with, I got to thinking about the gap between people who proof text and people who actually study the Bible and learn what the Bible says in context, in its grander context. And I got to thinking about the difference between people who compose long works of, complex works of classical music and people who write bubblegum songs with hooks. And the difference between people who write novels and people who are writers for sitcoms and just have to come up with kind of a clever premise and some wisecracks every week, and then they get their paycheck. And then I got to thinking about people who think deeply about how public institutions ought to work, and on the other hand, a lot of the staff members of the Trump campaign who from week to week will use a particular explanation to defend their boss and then abandon it the next week. Meanwhile, people who think deeply about how these institutions ought to work tear their hair out about how the explanations vary and there's never any consistency and there's all this rank hypocrisy. But someone who writes bubblegum music doesn't care that they've broken every rule of good composition. And someone who proof texts from the Bible doesn't care that they've taken verses out of context. And I have to say, sometimes even the people who are devoted to doing it in a more coherent and consistent fashion for any of those enterprises, they may like that bubblegum music as kind of a guilty pleasure. It is awfully tempting. Anyway, I don't know that that adds up to anything, but those are all things that were working on me this week, and who knows, Maybe it'll become something coherent by next week.